The story begins not in a ballroom or a boardroom, but in silence, the kind that settles over old houses long after the servants have gone to sleep. In that silence lived an heir whose name was spoken with reverence in banks and with envy in drawing rooms, yet rarely spoken aloud in his own home. He was born into an empire so old that its wealth felt less like money and more like gravity, an invisible force shaping lives without asking permission. From the day he arrived, his future was written in ledgers thicker than any Bible, and his role was clear: preserve, obey, continue. But the gilded walls that protected him also imprisoned him. While other children learned games, he learned expectations. Tutors taught him languages he would never speak freely and history that celebrated his family's triumphs, while quietly erasing its costs. Every portrait on the wall reminded him that his life was not his own. He was not raised to dream, but to inherit. In a nation that worshipped self-made men, he represented something older, heavier, and increasingly fragile. Outside those walls, America was changing. Steel rose where fields once stood. Railroads stitched together a restless country. Immigrants poured in with nothing but hunger and hope, believing that effort could outweigh birth. Yet inside the heir's world, effort was almost irrelevant. Wealth begat wealth. Power married power. The family fortune had survived wars, panics, and revolutions by adapting just enough to remain untouchable. And this was the future laid before him like a sacred duty. He was expected to sit on boards before he understood their purpose, to shake hands with men twice his age who spoke of profits as if they were weather patterns. But something in him resisted. It was not rebellion in the loud sense. It was a quiet discomfort, a sense that the story he had been handed was incomplete. He noticed the servants' fatigue, the factory strikes reported in newspapers he was told not to read too closely, the widening distance between the luxury he inhabited and the country that sustained it. As a young man, he did what heirs were supposed to do. He attended the right schools, joined the right clubs, wore his wealth with studied indifference. But beneath the tailored surface, questions accumulated. Why should one family command such influence simply because its name had been early and lucky? Why should fortunes endure untouched while cities around them burned with inequality? These were dangerous questions in a dynasty that survived by never asking them. The first cracks appeared when he chose curiosity over comfort. He traveled not as a prince among princes, but as an observer. He walked through neighborhoods his peers avoided and listened to people who had never been invited into his world. He saw labor up close, not as an abstraction but as aching hands and shortened lives. Each encounter chipped away at the myth of inevitability his family cherished. When he returned, he began to challenge small things. He questioned investments that crushed workers. He argued against practices justified only by tradition. At family dinners, his words fell like stones into crystal glasses. Elders reminded him that the fortune was a trust, not a toy, and that his duty was preservation, not innovation of conscience. To them, morality was charity after profit, never before. What made his challenge remarkable was not its volume, but its persistence. He did not storm out or renounce his name. He stayed inside the system and pushed against its load-bearing walls. He funded experiments that prioritized dignity over dividends. He supported reforms whispered about, but never endorsed by old money. Each act was small enough to be dismissed, yet together they formed a pattern the dynasty could no longer ignore. The backlash was subtle and devastating. Doors closed quietly, invitations slowed. Advisors warned him that he was endangering not just himself, but generations yet unborn. Newspapers hinted at eccentricity, at instability, the favored language used when power feels threatened. Within his own family, he became an embarrassment, proof that too much introspection could be a kind of weakness. Yet he persisted, because the alternative felt like a slow suffocation. He understood that America's oldest fortunes were built not just on brilliance, but on timing, exploitation, and protection from consequences. To challenge that truth was to challenge the moral foundation of his inheritance. And still, he did it, knowing he would never truly win. As the years passed, the fortune endured, but his place within it diminished. He was neither expelled nor embraced, existing instead in a gray exile funded by money he was slowly redirecting away from its original purpose. In public, he remained an heir. In private, he was a dissenter living off the very system he criticized, a contradiction he never fully resolved. History would not celebrate him the way it celebrated empire builders. There would be no monuments, no companies bearing his name in glowing letters. His legacy was quieter, harder to measure. It lived in altered contracts, in precedents set, in the idea that even the most entrenched power could be questioned from within. In the twilight of his life, he understood something his ancestors never had: that wealth, without reflection, becomes brittle, that dynasties fall not only from external attack, but from internal refusal to evolve. He had not dismantled America's oldest fortune, but he had forced it to look at itself, if only briefly, in an unforgiving mirror, and somewhere between the ledgers and the lives they affected, between inherited certainty and chosen doubt, the hidden life of this heir remained, unfinished, echoing through corridors lined with portraits that suddenly seemed less eternal than they once did from the moment of birth. Inheritance defines a life, long before character has the chance to speak. In households shaped by ancient wealth, identity is not discovered, it is assigned. A name arrives already burdened with meaning, with expectations that stretch backward through generations and forward into futures already negotiated in private rooms. Individual desire becomes secondary to continuity, and the self is shaped not by curiosity but by obligation. In such a world, freedom is not denied outright, it is simply never offered. The child grows surrounded by proof that the path has been chosen. Portraits of ancestors stare down with quiet authority, reminding him that his existence is not unique, but sequential. Education becomes preparation rather than exploration. Tutors and mentors emphasize responsibility over imagination, stability over risk. Even praise carries conditions, reinforcing that worth is measured by obedience to tradition rather than authenticity of thought. The message is constant and unspoken. You are not here to become, you are here to maintain. As adolescence approaches, the contradiction deepens. The heir is encouraged to see himself as exceptional, while being warned never to act independently. He is taught that leadership is his birthright, yet reminded that leadership means preserving systems built long before him. This creates a peculiar tension, one where confidence is demanded, but autonomy is discouraged. The mind is sharpened, but the boundaries around it are tightly drawn. Outside this world, a culture celebrates self-made achievement, but inside, effort feels ceremonial. Success is expected, failure is unthinkable, and experimentation is treated as recklessness. The heir begins to sense that his life is less a journey than a performance, rehearsed in advance and evaluated by invisible judges. Even rebellion, if it comes, must be tasteful and temporary, a youthful indulgence rather than a true divergence. Identity under such conditions becomes fragmented. Publicly, he performs the role flawlessly, adopting the language, mannerisms, and values required of his position. Privately, questions accumulate. Who is he without the fortune? Would his voice matter if his name did not open doors? Are his beliefs truly his own, or merely refined echoes of inherited ideology? These questions are dangerous because they threaten the illusion that lineage equals legitimacy. The struggle intensifies as adulthood arrives. Decisions once framed as learning experiences now carry permanent consequences. Every choice reflects not just on the individual, but on the family narrative. Marriage becomes strategy, friendships become alliances, and personal convictions are weighed against their potential to disrupt continuity. The self is constantly negotiated, bartered between inner truth and external expectation. This conflict is not dramatic in the way of poverty or exile, it is quieter and more corrosive. There is comfort, security, and access beyond imagination, yet a persistent sense of impersonation. The heir may possess everything, yet feel oddly absent from his own life. Identity becomes something worn rather than lived, an inherited costume tailored so precisely that removing it feels impossible. What Mac? This struggle profound is its invisibility. From the outside, the heir appears privileged beyond sympathy. Few recognize that inheritance can erase individuality as effectively as deprivation. When a life is predetermined, choice becomes an illusion, and the absence of struggle does not guarantee the presence of freedom. In many ways, the heir must fight harder to discover himself than those forced to define themselves through adversity. Over time, the desire for authenticity grows heavier than the comfort of compliance. The heir begins to understand that preserving a fortune at the cost of selfhood is a quiet kind of loss. Identity, once postponed, demands recognition. The question shifts from how to honor the past to whether a future without personal truth is worth inheriting at all. This is the central tension of inheritance versus identity, the battle between a life already written and the human need to author oneself. It is not a rejection of legacy, but a demand to exist as more than a caretaker of history, to be a person before being a symbol, and to claim a self that was never included in the inheritance. Itself challenging power from within requires a kind of courage that rarely looks heroic. It does not announce itself with slogans or sever ties in dramatic protest. Instead, it demands patience, restraint, and a willingness to endure isolation while remaining embedded in the very structure one seeks to change. For an heir born into entrenched authority, rebellion from the outside would have been simple and theatrical. Resistance from the inside was slower, quieter, and far more dangerous. Remaining within the system meant accepting its benefits while questioning its foundations, a contradiction that invited suspicion from all sides. To outsiders, his efforts seemed insufficient, compromised by continued access to wealth and influence. To insiders, they appeared disloyal, even traitorous. Yet this position between worlds was precisely where his challenge gained power. He understood the language of the boardroom, the unspoken rules of influence, and the pressure points others never saw. Reform, in his view, was not a performance but a process. His first acts were deliberately modest. Rather than confront the dynasty head-on, he redirected attention. He raised uncomfortable questions during meetings designed for consensus, not conflict. He requested data others preferred to ignore. He reframed success not solely as growth, but as sustainability and human consequence. These gestures were easy to dismiss individually, but collectively they disrupted the rhythm of unquestioned agreement that kept old power comfortable. What made this approach unsettling was its legitimacy. He could not be easily excluded or silenced, because he belonged. His name carried authority even when his ideas did not. Every challenge forced the institution to respond, if only defensively. By staying inside, he denied the dynasty its most reliable defense against dissent, exile. There was no outside enemy to discredit, no rival ideology to dismiss. The discomfort came from recognition. As his efforts continued, resistance hardened. Advisors cautioned him about destabilizing investor confidence. Family elders warned of reputational damage. Subtle mechanisms of control emerged. Committees formed without him. Decisions made before meetings began. Power rarely confronts critique openly. It prefers to redirect, delay, and exhaust. He learned that influence is often less about winning arguments than about surviving attrition. Still, he persisted, because he understood the fragility beneath the grandeur. Systems that have never been questioned mistake endurance for righteousness. By introducing doubt, he threatened the moral certainty that justified accumulation without accountability. His insistence on ethical consideration was perceived not as improvement, but as accusation. To suggest that change was necessary implied that the past had been flawed, a notion old power resists more fiercely than any external threat. The greatest cost of challenging from within was personal. Relationships cooled, trust eroded. The intimacy of shared purpose that binds dynasties weakened. He became someone listened to politely and avoided strategically. Isolation grew, not because he had left, but because he had stayed and refused to conform completely. This quiet alienation was the price of credibility, paid daily without recognition. Yet the impact of his presence was undeniable. Policies shifted incrementally, language changed. What was once unthinkable became discussable. Even opposition adapted, learning to justify decisions with arguments that acknowledged the values he introduced. In this way, resistance reshaped the institution not through victory, but through persistent pressure. The system evolved not because it agreed, but because it could no longer ignore. Challenging power from within also revealed the limits of reform. He discovered that some structures are designed to absorb criticism without transformation, to change appearance while preserving essence. This realization did not invalidate his efforts, but it clarified them. His goal was no longer to redeem the institution entirely, but to narrow the gap between power and responsibility, even if only slightly. In choosing this path, he rejected both blind loyalty and dramatic renunciation. He accepted the moral ambiguity of working inside a flawed system to reduce harm rather than achieve purity. This form of challenge lacks the clarity of rebellion, but it carries a deeper realism. It acknowledges that entrenched power rarely falls to force alone, it erodes through sustained internal tension. By staying, questioning, and refusing to be silent, he demonstrated that the most threatening dissent is not the outsider's attack, but the insider's conscience. Power can dismiss enemies, but it struggles to defend itself against those who speak its language and still insist it can do better. Wealth that remains untouched for too long begins to believe in its own permanence. When fortunes survive generation after generation, they stop seeing themselves as outcomes of circumstance and start viewing themselves as proof of destiny. This illusion of inevitability is the first stage of fragility. What endures without reflection hardens, and what hardens eventually cracks. The greatest weakness of ancient wealth is not external threat, but internal certainty. Old fortunes often mistake survival for virtue. Having weathered wars, depressions, and political shifts, they assume their methods are justified simply because they worked before. Adaptation becomes selective, limited to preserving control rather than reassessing purpose. Innovation is welcomed only when it increases returns, never when it questions legitimacy. Over time, wealth ceases to respond to the society that sustains it, creating a quiet separation between power and relevance. This separation is subtle at first. Institutions continue to function, profits continue to grow, and influence remains intact. But beneath the surface, trust erodes. Workers, communities, and even governments begin to see the fortune not as a contributor, but as an extractive force. The wealth remains impressive, yet increasingly hollow, defended by legal structures rather than social consent. When legitimacy is replaced by protection, fragility takes root. The danger of untouched wealth lies in its insulation. Surrounded by advisors whose interests align with preservation, old fortunes rarely hear unfilled. Arid truth. Warning signs are softened, risks are reframed, and moral consequences are translated into public relations challenges. This echo chamber creates a distorted sense of reality, where discomfort is treated as hostility and criticism as ignorance. The more insulated the fortune becomes, the less capable it is of recognizing its own vulnerabilities. History offers countless examples of this pattern. Dynasties that seemed invincible collapsed not because they lacked resources, but because they lacked adaptability. They underestimated social change, dismissed ethical reckoning, and assumed that past dominance guaranteed future security. When pressure finally arrived, it did so from multiple directions at once: public resentment, political reform, cultural rejection. By then, the tools that once ensured survival were no longer sufficient. Fragility also emerges in the moral dimension. Untouched wealth often separates success from consequence, allowing decisions to be judged solely by outcome rather than impact. Over time, this erodes internal accountability. When profit is the only measure that matters, ethical boundaries blur, and small compromises accumulate into systemic harm. The fortune grows, but its moral foundation thins, making it increasingly vulnerable to exposure and backlash. What makes this fragility dangerous is that it is rarely acknowledged from within. Power structures built on continuity resist self-critique, viewing it as unnecessary risk. Yet refusal to examine oneself is itself the greatest risk. In a changing society, relevance is not inherited, it is earned repeatedly. Wealth that cannot justify its existence beyond tradition eventually faces a reckoning it cannot control. The heir who recognized this understood that the greatest threat to the fortune was not reform, but stagnation. He saw that by refusing to evolve, the dynasty was storing up future collapse. Even modest self-examination could have strengthened it, renewing its relationship with the world around it. Instead, resistance to change preserved appearances while accelerating decay beneath them. Fragility does not announce itself with crisis, it reveals itself through rigidity. The inability to adjust, to listen, to concede error, turns strength into liability. Old wealth, that once thrived on adaptability, forgets that adaptability was ever necessary. In doing so, it abandons the very principle that allowed it to endure. The paradox of untouched wealth is that the more it clings to permanence, the more temporary it becomes. Fortunes that refuse reflection do not simply risk decline, they invite it. In a society that evolves relentlessly, the greatest danger to inherited power is the belief that it stands outside the need to change taken together. The story reveals a quiet but profound truth about legacy, power, and responsibility. The hidden life of this heir was never about rejecting wealth, but about confronting what wealth demands in return. Born into a fortune older than the nation's modern conscience, he stood at the crossroads between preservation and purpose, between inherited certainty and earned meaning. His struggle shows that privilege does not eliminate conflict. It merely relocates it inward, where the battle is less visible, but no less consequential. By choosing self-examination over comfort and conscience over convenience, he exposed the fragile assumptions beneath even the most enduring empires. His life reminds us that identity cannot be inherited, power cannot remain unquestioned, and wealth that refuses reflection ultimately weakens itself. True legacy is not measured by how long a fortune lasts, but by whether it learns, adapts, and justifies its place in the world it shapes. Trustworthy, powerful,